Now, turning to our program, I'm pleased to welcome Leah Fiesco, Director of Strategic Partnerships for the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, who's going to introduce our speaker. Leah. Ooh, I screwed something up. There we go. Okay.
Today, I have the honor of introducing Tom Florsheim, someone that in many ways in our community doesn't really need an introduction, but I will do the honor. Tom's background and accomplishments are incredibly impressive. He grew up on the east side of Milwaukee. He completed his undergraduate at the University of Colorado in Boulder and received his MBA from Columbia University in New York. He joined Weyco Group and after college, and then returned to the company after receiving his MBA, and has been chairman and CEO since 2002. Of course, we all know that he is also heavily involved in our local region. He serves on the boards of the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, Milwaukee College Prep, which is a 4-campus network of K-8 schools, and currently serves as the chairman of the University School Endowment Fund. And then, of course, in his spare time, he also is on the board of Stratec, which is an auto supplier in Milwaukee. I have had the privilege of working with Tom and his family via his leadership and support, first of the Greater Milwaukee Committee, and now the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. And when I say it's a privilege to work with Tom, it is truly a privilege. Tom is an inspirational leader who is strategic and kind, and he's always willing to raise his hand, not simply to mitigate an issue or help mitigate an issue, but to solve a problem. And so I know he'll be in a familiar and friendly crowd here because, of course, as Rotarians, we all pride ourselves in doing the same thing. He understands the complex nature of the issues our region faces, but never lets those complexities freeze him or overwhelm him, or maybe they do and we just don't see it. He's always willing to dive in. And one of the things that I admire most about Tom is that he always seems to ask the best questions, which is, of course, is an art and a science all at the same time. The questions he asks get to the heart of an issue, and at the same time, they seem to thoughtfully open up and inspire conversation, which is difficult and hard. But always welcome. And of course, his questions ultimately lead to a strong path and strategy moving forward for every organization and opportunity I've had the privilege of working with Tom on. And I know, of course, we'll all have great questions for him if time arises here. And so with that, I'm delighted to bring to the stage Tom Florsheim.
Good afternoon, everyone. First I want to thank Leah for that. It's going to be a little hard to live up to those remarks, but I'm going to start out by just kind of giving you a little bit of a roadmap of how I'm going to do this today, how I'm going to talk about Weyco Group. The first thing I'm going to do is just give you some basic information, and then I'm going to talk about how the pandemic affected our business. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our history, which I find kind of interesting, but I'm a little bit biased. And then I'm going to talk about our brands. We have 4 major brands that I'm going to just speak to fairly briefly. And then I'm going to talk about our strategy for growth. So I'm going to jump right in here. And just a couple of basic facts. We're headquartered in Glendale, Wisconsin. We're a publicly traded company on the NASDAQ market, and I put our ticker symbol up there. About 85% of our revenue is from wholesale, which means selling our shoes to retailers like Macy's and people like that. And the remaining 15% is consumer direct. And so that's through stores And today it's actually mostly through our website. So we have a website for each brand. We have a design center headquartered in Glendale, which is just 20 minutes north of here. And one of your fellow Rotarians, is that what you call? Okay, all right, good, got that right. Kevin Ringgold, who's not here today because he's traveling for business, runs our design and development office in Glendale, and we recruited him about 20 years ago from New Balance, and he's done just a great job for the company. And so we designed the majority of what we call our legacy brands in Milwaukee. We also have an office out in Portland, Oregon, where we design our outdoor brands. And we have two outdoor brands, one big one, Bogs footwear, and then one small one, which we just acquired last year called Forsake. And it's kind of like a sneaker boot company, which I'm not going to really talk about today. It's going to focus on the big brands. I think an interesting thing, just from a Wisconsin history standpoint, is that we started out as a manufacturer of footwear in Wisconsin. We had 9 factories here. And what happened in the shoe industry is as labor got more expensive in the U.S., almost all of the shoemakers that stayed successful went offshore, and the model completely changed. Everybody in Milwaukee knows Allen Edmonds, and Allen Edmonds is actually one of the few shoe manufacturers that still manufactures in the U.S., but you have to remember their shoes are $300 basically, unless you buy them at the shoe bank, which most people who are buying them in Milwaukee do. So they're a little less expensive. But the point being, you can only manufacture shoes in Milwaukee if they're going to be quite expensive, or the U.S. if they're going to be quite expensive. And so during the 70s and 80s, all of our manufacturing moved offshore. First to Europe. We made shoes in Italy and Spain. And then later, and still today, in Asia, meaning India and China, Cambodia. And we do make some shoes in the Dominican Republic and Mexico as well. But the model of our industry completely changed. I love telling people that Nike doesn't own a shoe factory, because Nike doesn't own a shoe factory, and we don't own a shoe factory today. Where we used to own a bunch of them in the U.S., the model changed where we're contracting with people that own factories overseas, and so those fixed costs go away, which is kind of nice, and they turn into variable costs. And we have in all the places where we manufacture, we have a team of people overseas. And so we have a team of people in India, we have a team of people in China, and they do the quality control. We have development people, so Kevin Ringgold's department communicates with them. So there's a lot of interaction, but the model has completely changed, and that really happened as we moved through the 70s and 80s. So I just want to touch on the pandemic. And the picture up there, I think everybody's pretty familiar with all the supply chain issues that we've run into the last 3 years, but that's a picture of one of the West Coast ports and the backup of ships. And, so to start out in 2020, the first quarter of the year was decent because it was pre-COVID. And then when COVID hit, our business in the dress shoe part of the business, which is the majority of our business, basically shut down. I mean, the phone literally stopped ringing. And people were staying at home. They were wearing sweat clothes. They were wearing their Birkenstocks or Crocs. And they weren't buying any Florsheim shoes. I can tell you that. And it was a unnerving period of time for us. And I'll get into that a little more in a minute. Fortunately, Bogs, which is our outdoor brand, got a boost of business because people were getting outdoors. They wanted to be safe, and so there was much more outdoor activity. So we did better with that brand, but the other brands really struggled. And then in 2021, when the vaccines came out, so around April or May, people started to get out again. And some of this stuff you just could not predict. There was no way to see what was coming next, because we went about 18 months selling very, very few dress shoes. And I work with my brother, John, and we would have discussions like, is the dress shoe business ever going to come back? What are we going to do with these dress shoe brands? Is anybody going to ever buy dress shoes again? And Sure enough, once people started to go to social events, they wanted to look good because they hadn't really been socializing for more than a year. And so they wanted to buy new clothing, they wanted to buy new shoes, and they hadn't bought any dress shoes in a year and a half or 2 years. And so the dress shoe business just started to boom. And we would have never predicted that. And so the next problem came where we had this incredible demand, but we couldn't get the supply in. And just to give you an example of what all these supply chain bottlenecks did to in our business, and they affected many, many businesses. It typically takes about a month to get shoes from a factory in China to our distribution center in Glendale. During 2021, it took about 3 months. And the other thing that happened was the price of shipping a pair of shoes historically is about $1. During the pandemic or after the pandemic, when everybody was buying all this stuff on Amazon, people were sitting at home ordering everything online, the price of freight for a pair of shoes went up to almost $4. And so, it was impossible to build that into our pricing. It took us several seasons to start getting a little bit of that freight cost back. So 2021 was pretty challenging still. And then 22, last year, rolled around, and people in our industry called it the year of the wedding, because if I have these numbers right, there were more weddings last year than in any year since 1984, because all of these postponed weddings took place the end of 2021 or 2022. And I'm sure everybody in this room knows people that canceled their wedding like 2 or 3 times thinking this was going to be over, and then kept rescheduling. So the demand continued to be very, very strong last year, and the supply chain eased up. And so we're actually able to get the shoes in to fill the demand, which was wonderful. And I'm going to show you some charts in a second with what actually happened to our revenues during that period of time. But for the business people in the room, I think that it's really easy when times are good to really not look under the rocks and see problematic areas or areas of the business that are not profitable. And when business is bad, you kind of have the time and you kind of go back to the fundamentals. And so the 2 years of the pandemic, 20 and 21, we really went back to the fundamentals and we looked at everything, and we made a lot of changes in our business to prepare for the day when we were hoping this would be over. And so we closed a lot of unprofitable stores, and it's hard to get out of stores because you have to buy your way out of leases. And we had a office and distribution center in Florence, Italy, which was great to have. It was fun to go to Florence, but it hadn't been profitable for years, and so we closed that down. And we did a lot of things to kind of clean up our business. So I don't know if you can read this, but I'll just kind of talk through these numbers. We're a public company, as I mentioned, so all of this information is public. In 2019, the year before the pandemic, which is kind of it's the baseline year, it's the last normal year, we did about a little more than $300 million in sales, and our net earnings were about $21 million. Then the next year in 2020, the first quarter was okay because it was before the pandemic. And then the next 3 quarters, we just got slammed. And our business was down for the year about 35%, which just kills you because you lose all your leverage. And so we lost $8.5 million. And I think that was the first year that we ever lost any money. And so it was painful, to say the least. In 2021, we started to come back, and the first quarter of that year, we still were in the pandemic, so it wasn't really a full year. And we also had these supply chain issues, and so we did about $267 million, and we made about $20 million in net income. And then this year, I can't talk about fourth quarter or the full year because we're coming out with that in March, and being a public company, you have to be careful not to talk about that. But you can see that through the first 3 quarters, we did about $250 million, and we made about $19 million. And when you go back to 2019, For the same period of time, we did about 212 million and made about 12. So you can see just from seeing 3 quarters that 2022 was a very strong year for us. I'm going to give you a brief history of the company, and this is a little bit confusing. So I'm going to try to explain this the best I can. So in 1892, Florsheim Shoe Company was founded in Chicago. In 1906, Weinberg Shoes was founded in Milwaukee. 2 completely separate companies, no relationship whatsoever. In 1952, my grandfather, Harold Florsheim, and Florsheim at the time was publicly traded, sold his interest, which was a majority interest in the company, to International Shoe, which was at the time one of the largest shoe companies in the world. Coincidentally, that year, my father started at Florsheim Shoe Company, so he went to work at Florsheim in 1952. And my grandfather stayed on and ran the company for many years, for like a decade at least, more than a decade. And eventually, it moved on to other management. And so my father came up to Milwaukee. He left the company for a variety of reasons, and he came up to Milwaukee. And he purchased an interest in Weinberg shoe manufacturing. There was a man, Frank Weinberg, who was in his 80s, and he had built this company. And the brand that they sold was actually Weinberg Shoe. And my father was able to buy part of his interest and then become CEO of that company. And he was looking for a successor. So then in 1967, Weinberg bought Nunn Bush, which was a Milwaukee company. And then 1971, Weinberg, with my father there, bought Stacy Adams, which was a company out of Brockton, Mass. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute. In 1990, we changed our name to Weyco Group because we no longer sold Weinberg shoes. It was Stacy Adams and Nunn Bush. So our offices, really since 1906, when Frank Weinberg set up his company, were in Brewers Hill. And so we were right above the old Roots restaurant on Reservoir Avenue. And we had a 5-floor office and distribution center in a very old building with a distribution center across the street. We had a distribution center in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. So in 1999, we built a modern facility in Glendale and consolidated everything into that facility, both office and distribution. So then time goes on, and Florsheim ran into financial problems. And so in 2002, my brother and I, through Weyco Group, acquired Florsheim back on the 50th anniversary of when we sold the brand. And that doesn't happen very often. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And then in 2011, we acquired Bogs. And so I'm going to quickly go through the other brands, and then I'm going to focus on Florsheim. And the reason that I'm going to focus on Florsheim is because it really that acquisition changed the scale of our business. And, it was very meaningful in many ways. So Stacy Adams is actually our oldest brand. It was founded in 1875, and it's a contemporary brand whose customer is more fashion forward. A lot of men don't want people looking at their feet. They'd rather just have like pretty basic shoes. A lot of our Stacy Adams shoes are fashion forward, and they're for the guy that really wants people looking at his feet. They want people to notice how he's dressed, and it's a guy that's more fashion conscious. The retail on Stacy Adams is about $80 to $90, and while there are fewer and fewer independent shoe retailers every year in the U.S., there's still quite a few left, and Stacy Adams sells a lot of them, especially in the cities, in the larger cities. And then Stacy Adams sells department stores like Macy's. And Nunn Bush is a Milwaukee-born brand, and we actually use that tagline, "Born in Milwaukee," today on our brand. It was founded in 1912, and one of the original buildings is on 5th and Hubbard here in the city. It targets a middle-income consumer, so it's a consumer that's focused on value and comfort. And when you look at men's purchasing habits, the number one thing that's important to men when they buy their shoes is comfort. The number two thing is brand. And so this brand really focuses on that comfort aspect. And it's around $75 retail, but it's promotional, which means the sale price, the out the door price, the price people really pay for the brand is more like $59.90. And it's sold at volume places like Kohl's and Nordstrom Rack, and then e-commerce sites as well. And it's designed to appeal to a very broad audience. And then Florsheim, as I mentioned, was founded in Illinois in 1892, and it targets a different consumer than the two other brands. And that's really an important point, because as we've built this portfolio of brands, we want each brand to be in their own segment of the market, because you don't want your sales forces competing with each other. It doesn't make sense to have 3 or 4 brands that are all fighting for the same consumer. So all of these brands really stand for very different things. And the distribution is to the better department stores like Nordstrom. Most people probably in this room are familiar with Von Maur. It's a regional department store, but it's more in the Midwest, and it's like a little Nordstrom. Macy's, and then some of the shoe chains as well, like DSW, and then e-commerce. And the styling is meant to appeal to a person who's aware of the trends but not trendy. And just a little bit of information about the men's shoe business that I think is interesting. One of the reasons that we like the men's business as opposed to the women's business is that the styles change very, very slowly. So your inventory is good for several seasons. It's a lot easier to forecast the men's business than the women's. When it changes every season, it's much more fickle. And so, just to give you an example of that, this is true. One of the biggest trends in men's footwear over the last decade is that people are wearing cognac shoes. And I see some when I look around the room. You know, for many, many years, men bought black dress shoes. That was it. And then we watch what's happening on ESPN, because once the commentators on ESPN start wearing cognac shoes, then the average person, average guy thinks, okay, those guys are wearing cognac shoes with a navy suit or a gray suit. I can do that. And so it kind of gives people a license to step out a little bit. Men are slow to change. And so over the last 10 years, progressively, cognac shoes have become like the biggest seller color-wise as opposed to black. The other thing, and this is a little bit newer phenomenon, is white soles on shoes. So again, you know, it's like really started slowly. It started with really high-end brand or higher-end brands like Cole Haan came out with these white bottom shoes. It's obviously influenced by the sport athletic look. And so once the ESPN guys start wearing white bottom shoes with their suits, then you know it's going to be big. And so we have a lot of white soled shoes really in all of our brands today, but I've got a picture up of it's a fabric upper shoe with a white sole on the bottom part of that slide, bottom right. And actually the bottom left too. So here are just some Florsheim archival pictures. There's 3 pictures of old Florsheim shoe shops. It was pretty interesting because what Florsheim did was as malls were developed in the U.S., which all of the malls in this country, most of them were built in the 60s and 70s. And as those malls were built, Florsheim went into every single mall, and they'd get good locations. And, you know, this was before athletic shoes came out, so they were like the dominant dress shoe. And at one point, they had 600 stores, mostly in malls. And then you also just see the bottom right-hand photo is of Florsheim Shoe Factory opening in Chicago. That was the grand opening. And then you've got a couple people, one gentleman cutting leather for a pair of shoes and a woman stitching for a pair of shoes. And so why buy back a troubled brand? Because I think probably most of the people in this room were aware that when we bought this brand back in 2002, you know, it really lost its shine. And the brand had been sold a few different times. And when we bought it back, Most of you have probably heard of Leon Black, who for many years ran Apollo, which is it's one of the country's biggest private equity companies. And he spun off, he bought Florsheim and he spun it off as a publicly traded company, and just did everything wrong. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a second. But why do we want this brand? It lost about $30 million the year before we bought it, so other people were really afraid of it. But we'd followed the brand for years, and because of, I just want to do a time check here. Got like 10 minutes left? Okay. Because the brand had our name on it, but because we had this divide in our family, my brother and I had really never set foot in a Florsheim office building, and we really didn't go in the stores much either, but we always had this affinity for the brand, and we always kind of fantasized about how great it would be if we got the brand back, but never ever thought it'd happen because it was a company that was 5 times as big as we were. And so, and we also knew that there's this very, very brand loyal consumer. One of the market studies that people do, and we did it when we were looking at acquiring the brand back, is unaided awareness. And unaided awareness just is when you ask, 500 people, what brand comes to mind when you think of dress shoes? The number one answer was still Florsheim, even though the brand had been beat up. So after 50 years, we were able to buy the brand, and we took on a bunch of debt to bring it back to Milwaukee. And so one of the things that I think most business people aspire to, maybe not, but we thought it was pretty cool. The New York Times called us up a few years after we bought the brand back, and they wanted to do a story for the Sunday business section, which is, the place to be if you're, in the New York Times in business. And so they came out to Milwaukee and they spent a couple days with us. And then they wrote this big article. It's a couple pages long. You can Google it if you want to see it. Called "The Florsheims Back in Their Own Shoes." And it was just one of those moments. You do a lot of stuff in business that's very mundane, and you have a lot of things that don't work out. And this was one of those moments that just it worked out. And so we had a lot of repositioning to do when we bought the brand back because it was a pretty big mess. But we'd been in the business for years with these other brands, and so we knew how to run this business, and so we were able to integrate the business very quickly. I'm going to kind of breeze through a couple of these slides just so I stay on time here. But our sales the year before we bought the brand were $132 million, and we earned about $9.5 million. So that was the year before we purchased Florsheim back. So the first full year that we owned the brand was 2003, and we basically doubled our revenues, and we almost doubled our net earnings, and we paid off the debt in 3 years. And we'd never borrowed money before, and we certainly were a little scared with the amount that we did borrow. And with that purchase, as I mentioned earlier, it just changed the scale of our business. And so we're able to expand our distribution center in Glendale, and today it's about 1.2 million square feet, which is the size essentially of an Amazon distribution center. And we ship 7 or 8 million pairs a year. And at any given time, we have about 3.5 million pairs of shoes in that distribution center. And then our headquarters continue to expand. And Kevin, the other Rotarian, or your colleague in the Rotary, has really helped us grow our brands. He hired, he grew our design department, so we have 2 designers and a developer for each brand. And we do a lot of stuff internally in that Glendale headquarters, which has really worked out very well. And our concept for growing is really to leverage that platform. And so this is just a picture of the distribution center, and it's fairly high tech, where there's it's paperless. Everybody has a little handheld that they use on their hand. It has like a finger scanner. And then this is our office. We completely remodeled our office right before the pandemic, which worked out very, very well because we had all the technology we needed for Zooming and to do everything that we needed to do when we couldn't travel for a couple of years. And we had a lot of collaboration space, and when we wanted people to come back to the office, it was easier to get them to come back. And I do want to give a shout out to Allison D'Amico, who happens to be here today. She's with HGA, and she did all the work on this. And so I spent a lot of time with Allison for a year, and I have to tell you that she just did an amazing job. And so if you need to remodel your office, I highly recommend HGA. So I'm going to rush through this ending part. When you look at our brands, even though they represent different segments of the dress and dress casual market, they all basically share a lot of the same retailers, and there's some overlap between the brands. So we looked at casual brands for a long time. And when you're going to buy a brand, you look at 20 of them or 30 of them, and sometimes you never find one. And we found this brand that was based in Eugene, Oregon, that was called Bogs. And they had a very unique premium product, and they sold every gender, the kids, women's, and men's, which we had never done. And we fell in love with this brand. The guy that owned it didn't want to sell it. And so we courted him for like 3 years, and I finally convinced him to sell. And he stayed on and ran the brand for a few years. And now his sons today run the brand. We moved it from Eugene to Portland, and we run sales, marketing, and design out of Portland, and we do all the back office stuff in Milwaukee. So from 2011, the year that we bought the brand, we did $30 million, and we grew it to $68 million in 2021, and it grew again last year. It's been a great brand for us. Just globally, we sell Florsheim around the world. We sell it to every continent except for Antarctica. And we do that either with our own wholesale setup. We have distribution centers in Melbourne, Australia, in Hong Kong, in Montreal. And so we sometimes do it ourselves. We sometimes do it through licensees, and we sometimes do it through franchise stores. In South America and Central America, there's a lot of Florsheim franchise stores. And we're trying to grow our other brands overseas as well. So, this is my last slide. And so basically, when we look ahead, lifestyles become more and more casual. And so we know that with all of our brands, we have to continue to evolve them to become more casual. But we also recognize, and we really saw this in 21 and 22, where nobody really wanted to be in the dress shoe business because everything was moving casual. We stayed in the dress shoe business, at least with a percentage of our styles, because it was our heritage. And when everything happened post-pandemic, we realized, how lucky we were that we did that. And over the last decade, most of our competition has moved almost entirely casual. And Cole Haan's an example of that. Cole Haan's at a different price point than us. But so there's much less competition, which gives us more room to grow. The other thing that as we look forward, is getting into the outdoor business in a bigger way. It's a very different business than the dressy part of the business. And we've had success there, and so we're going to continue to try to acquire brands to continue to grow. So I'm going to stop there, and thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
As a sneakerhead, I want to say thank you for this amazing presentation. My question, something you mentioned during 21 and 22, was that the cost for supplies rose. What you didn't mention was any sort of extra costs incurred to the customer. Is that accurate?
No, I left that part out. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
No, basically, we had a lot of inflationary pressures the last few years. So we had factories that raise their prices because there's inflation overseas where we're making the shoes. And then the biggest single thing was the freight, which I talked about. And so basically our contracts with our customers are about 6 months out, when we take the orders. And because of all the supply chain issues, we were more like a year out because we encouraged everybody to give us the orders further out. So we were locked into those prices. But as we moved forward and started selling shoes for future seasons, we slowly raised our prices. And so our prices at wholesale and at retail are up about between 10 and 15%. Good question, though. Thank you.
Hi, given the evolving geopolitical realities with China and the U.S., are you doing anything to adjust your sourcing in Asia?
Yes, we are. That's a great question, and it's when you think about things that keep you up at night, that's a big one. And our industry, going back 10 years ago, was 90% in China, and the whole industry's been focused on diversifying even before all this geopolitical tension. And so we've been trying. We've been in India for about 30 years, and I actually just got back from there. I was there last week, trying to increase our production. And we're trying to get as much out of China as we can and diversify our supply base, but it's not easy to do. China supplies components to the factories all over the world. So you make shoes in India, but you buy the bottoms from China. And so it's a very complicated supply chain. So it's not easy to do, but we're trying really hard and we're doubling down on it right now because of what you brought up.
Tom, thanks so much for the insight on your company. It's been fascinating. In terms of women's fashion, I would agree with you. I think I'm pushing 3.5 million shoes at my house. So, yeah. But the question I have for you, innovation. How do you stay on top of innovation? I look at a company like Deckers and what Hoka has done for Deckers. How do you look forward and really embrace that innovation?
Yeah, it's about being immersed, I think, in the market. And I would say that the toughest brand to design is probably Stacy Adams, which is our most fashion-forward brand, and Bogs, which has a women's component and has a kids component. And our design and development people, they couldn't do it during COVID, but typically they're in the market shopping and seeing what competitors are doing in the really important markets and in the outdoor area that's mostly out west. And in fashion, it's New York and Chicago and places like that. And then they go to a lot of the shows too. And, they're in Europe, has been a leader in fashion, so they follow what's going on in Europe. And so we just try to follow the trends. Fortunately, and when we're looking at acquisitions, we try to look at things that aren't moving too quickly, that aren't on the cutting edge. Because if you're in a business that's very junior, like a Steve Madden or a Vans, it's really, really tough. And if you get it wrong, you're going to get stuck with a lot of inventory. So we try to look at trends, but do so in a way that we think they have some staying power. But we're always out there. Our design and development guys, and women and men, are always out there shopping the market and seeing what's going on.
Tom, thanks for being here. Appreciate everything you do for education in the city as well. So I met Kevin in about the second year that he came. And when I met him, I said, typical, where are you from? What do you do? He's like, I'm a footwear designer. I'm from Long Island. Like, what are you doing here? Right. So, well, what is Weyco doing, and what can other companies in the city do to attract, retain, and scale up employees for the next generation?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. And, I don't know if I know the exact answer to that, but we've been successful in bringing a number of people to Milwaukee, and people tend to like it and they tend to stay. When I look at the people running Florsheim today, people probably in this room know Kevin Schiff and Beverly Goldberg. Kevin's from New York. Beverly Goldberg is from Texas. we have people at the company from all over, and we recruit them. We talk about how great Milwaukee is. They come, they visit. You know, if they like the company and they like the culture of the company and they like the city enough to give it a chance, what we've found is they stay. And you know, that has been, I think, one of our successes is building a team of people that's fairly diverse from all over the country. And you know, in Kevin's case, he moved here pre-children, you know, and he was you know, he was at the stage of his life where he wanted to settle down. The cost of living in Milwaukee obviously is much cheaper than in Long Island, and he had 2 children here, you know, with his wife, and they went to school in Milwaukee. One's in college, one's still in high school, and it's been a great place. And I mean, I think we've learned over the years how to sell Milwaukee, and you know, that's important to be able to do, and it's worked out. We've had very little problems, very few problems getting people. I mean, you don't hire everybody you interview, but it's like, or everybody you want, but you know, we've had pretty good success with that.
Thanks so much for your presentation today. I'm curious, you talked about the growth in casual and the dress area shoes, but I'm curious, what's the whole market like? Is it growing over time, the entire shoe market?
Yeah, no, the entire shoe market, if you exclude athletics, is very slow growing. You know, there's like, it grows basically at the rate of GNP or GDP. And, you know, so it's 2% a year. And that's why one of our biggest strategies is acquisition. It's really hard with mature brands to get organic growth. And so we've had some luck with that the last couple of years or the last few years, but it's a very slow growing industry.
Thanks again. 2 very brief comments. The first is, if I could find fashion-forward, comfortable shoes at an $80 to $100 price point, I would have 300 of those. My second comment is, as a native Milwaukeean, I remember growing up and hearing about Nunn Bush and Stacy Adams and Florsheim, and I just wanted to congratulate you as having a legacy brand that I think everyone in southeastern Wisconsin is very proud to have you as part of our economy and home. So thank you very much for all you do.
Thank you very much for saying that. All right. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It was really fun talking here today, so I appreciate you asking me to come.